First of all, my name is Matthew Soper, but to ask a theoretical question, which was touched on just here, there's actually still a legal issue at play, and that's the fact that the EU Referendum Act of last year didn't mandate what happens regardless of how the vote takes place. So Parliament could decide that they're not going to act on this issue, even though the world markets have already acted. The FTSE's gone crazy, the pound has gone crazy. So what now? I mean, we have a legal issue, we have a political issue, but potentially Parliament doesn't have to act at this point in time. And what would happen?
Well, I think let's address some of this. I mean, Tom, this has been an issue that we've all been talking around the water cooler about as well, because this is exactly, I think it's on everyone's minds in London, in the politics, as well as in Brussels.
Yeah, so, I mean, firstly, on this Article 50 process, which has to be sort of officially triggered, and then there's an automatic exit after 2 years, cannot be suspended unless all the member states agree. The UK does not want to trigger that in the immediate future. Cameron, I think, did something really smart when he said he'd leave it to his successor. That was partly on principle, but I think also to buy time, because if once you get into that process, the rest of the EU has all the leverage, right? And so the UK has very little leverage and is sort of captive to the demands of other countries, which have started to come pretty thick and fast. So within 24 hours, Spain said it would require joint sovereignty over Gibraltar as a condition of any future relations deal, and there are other sort of red lines, as well. So the UK wants to buy time. It definitely won't happen before there's a new prime minister. When the new prime minister takes office, whether it's Theresa May or I think probably will be her, or if it's Boris Johnson or even someone else, you could easily say that they want some time to get established before actually triggering Article 50. And they may set the point as being after the French election because it would be hard to get anything done before. So we're really talking potentially in a year's time, right? I mean, that could buy up to a year. Now, the rest of Europe has sort of been quite adamant that that is too long. Merkel, while she said that there should be some time, has said, they've been indicating it's around 3 months what they have in mind, not a year. Others have said immediately, but there's no way of forcing it. There's no way of forcing it. And so Britain can hold out on this for as long as it wants. Domestically, it may be difficult to do it indefinitely. It's probably impossible, but certainly they can buy some time, slow things down, and try to figure out sort of where things are. On the second referendum, I would just say I do think this is a possibility, but it would require a lot of things to happen. It would require everyone wanting to reverse it, which is not obvious. That would happen. You are expecting people to be reasonable, but there may be unreasonable people and, developments that just mitigate against a reasonable negotiation. You would probably need a general election, and you would need a coherent Labour Party that would actually make a second referendum part of its platform. And then you couldn't just have a second referendum to reverse the vote. I think you would need to have it on something else. So it would perhaps have to be on the terms of the negotiation that the UK government got to leave. And then you would say, well, in 2016, you gave the British government a mandate to negotiate an exit. Now they have negotiated an exit. Now you decide, is it what they promised initially, or does it fall short? And so you give them that option. And I think that's quite democratic. It's not very British for the reasons you said, because referendums aren't very British. And I agree with Lord Jenkins. I think you can certainly make a principled case against it. But, the genie being out of the bottle, you could make a case, but that would be more 2019-ish rather than in the next 12 months.
So the only point I would add is that delay has cost.
Right. Yeah.
Right? There's an economic uncertainty. I do a lot of work in financial technology, and up until last week, London was well positioned to be the global leader in fintech. They had a great regulatory regime. The U.S. was trying to catch up. The White House had an event, the OCC, et cetera. Well, if you were starting a fintech firm right now, would you want to start it in London?
Well, the other aspect of this that Geoffrey touched on, that you actually raised as well, about the future of the UK, plays somewhat into this response that you had, Tom. As Geoffrey mentioned, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, also flew to Brussels. Not everybody met with her, but she was clearly making a pitch for the consideration of Scotland and its decision, at least the voters' decision in the referendum to remain. And also because Scotland's status within the United Kingdom at the referendum on independence, another referendum back in September 2014, seems to be to a large part determined by the fears of Scottish voters about the likelihood of being outside of the European Union if they voted to leave the United Kingdom. So we've kind of gone full circle again back to some of the issues that were raised in that referendum. There's been some speculation in the press that perhaps Nicola Sturgeon could use the very large number of SNP members of Parliament in the UK Parliament, in Westminster, not just obviously in the Scottish Parliament, to try to block in some way this movement towards the triggering of Article 50, or perhaps call for some new referendum. And how likely is that to play out? And then, of course, there's the Northern Ireland aspect of this too. Yes, this is to you. I'm sorry. Holly's looking at me kind of, why are you asking me this? But I'm asking you this, Tom. But you can also have a comment on this as well.
I have no comment.
So I think that Scotland, clearly there are big implications for Scotland. I don't disagree with anything you said, but I think we need to be a little cautious before saying that Scotland is about to leave the UK, because there are several barriers. For one, they need a second referendum on independence, and it's by no means certain that a Conservative government will grant them that. Certainly in the near term, they could put it off to the next Parliament, they could deny it overall. Scotland can't have it unilaterally. If they have it unilaterally, it's illegitimate, it has no legal standing. So, when you put that to Scottish independence supporters, they say, yes, but that will cause a constitutional crisis and a standoff. Yes, well, maybe, and that may very well be true, but it does still, it's a fact that it's not an automatic procedure. The second thing is that while I think you're right that being outside the EU was a factor in them losing the independence referendum, the larger factor was the currency question and other issues which remain unresolved, and in many ways are exacerbated by a weak England. And so if you have a weak English economy and a weak overall economy, to actually have Scottish independence in that circumstance, is not great. And it's in an international context where the price of oil has plummeted from what it was. And so the oil plan for revenue doesn't hold up either. None of that is to say that Scotland won't become independent, but I think that they have a number of obstacles to overcome. And then they also have the problem within the EU, where Spain and others don't want the precedent to be set for Catalonia and other secessionist movements. So I think that the Scotland thing is very real, but we're looking more at a 5-year timetable rather than something that's going to happen at great speed.
But could Scotland and Northern Ireland both make a pitch now in some form? This makes it quite complicated to think how they would do this to slow this down and be able to maybe also put a brake on some of the demands from the EU to move more quickly. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think they will, and I think the Irish government will, and is already sort of arguing to slow it down, and will sort of use the peace process in Northern Ireland as a reason. Mm-hmm. I think many European leaders will find it difficult to resist that logic, because that is something that Europe has a role in. That is one of the great achievements of the last sort of 20 years in Europe, and there'll be a lot of sensitivity to that.
Aaron's point about the youth vote is also very interesting, because we've seen protests by students who didn't vote for a variety of reasons. Some, because they didn't see the importance of it, others because it was actually difficult to vote. And now, and a lot of protests, and a number of EU parliamentary officials saying, students of Britain, we remain with you. This is a kind of an interesting development here, but I don't know whether Tommy or Aaron, you might have some thoughts about student movements and how likely that might be to change things, because you talked about the economics of this on the youth side. It's about opportunity. And obviously, there's a very high opportunity cost now for students within the UK, as well as EU students who like to study in the UK, and the impact that this could have on the British education system.
Well, I think the old trade-off, you know, should I have a beer or should I go vote? And typically the beer
That was
won.
an expensive
and,
beer, yeah.
Right. So there's a fair amount of regrets flowing around social media.
Do you think it's going to have an
young
impact
people.
on the ranking of British universities globally, and on some of the decisions that people might make about research and development, science base? Or is this just too early to be able to have a conclusion on that?
I can't imagine that will be the immediate or a significant part of the impact.
So it's still okay for our colleagues at SICE across the way to kind of think about doing some of the firmer studies, perhaps at LSE or something? You don't see any downsides here to the... Because this is, of course, a big part of the British economy as well as the educational sector.
I think everywhere there is an issue, and we've had this at Brookings, of the difficulties sometimes of people with whom we would like to talk, getting visas to be able to come and participate in a range of discussions. And the more you're isolated and have separate processes, etc., the harder that process of academic freedom and discussion becomes. Lots
of moving parts. Yes, so a number of questions. Thanks, Peter. I'd like to bring in David Riley from the British Embassy here at the front as well.
Thank you, David Riley from the British Embassy. Thank you, Fiona. And thank you for this event. I think it's an important discussion and debate to be had. I actually have 4 points I wanted to make, so if you're happy to make them now, then I will.
Yes, please do.
The first, I think, is I want people to remember the scale of this exercise. This was one of the greatest democratic exercises we've had in the UK in recent years. 33 million people voted. We had a turnout around about 70%. And ultimately, 1.2 million people decided, more than the others, that they wanted to leave the EU. And I think this gets to the point that this gentleman here was talking about. The PM was clear this was a once in a generation question. There was no second attempt. And if some of the questions we're hearing today are about does the next Prime Minister have to obtain democratic legitimacy for the outcome, or how does he or she obtain that? That is a question for the Prime Minister. I would say that while the legislation is not binding on the government, nor does legislation say that the Parliament has a role in invoking Article 50. So it is for the PM to decide, I think, when to invoke Article 50 and the extent to which he or she wishes to involve Parliament. That's actually my first and second points together. My third point is on Scotland. Firstly, we had a referendum 2 years ago. The outcome was clear, and all major parties undertook to respect that outcome. But in addition to that, the Prime Minister was clear on Friday, and has been clear again since, that he sees it as his job and the job of his successor to protect the interests of all parts of the United Kingdom. And, this government will do that, and we will involve the devolved administrations, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, in those consultations as we move forward to ensure their interests are taken into account. And the fourth point is just to reinforce a point that you made earlier on, Fiona, that nothing has changed for the UK at the moment. We remain a full member of the European Union with all of the rights and obligations that come with that. But I wanted to make one other point, which has been, I think, debated around town in recent days. I mean, the EU is part of our makeup, but it does not define the UK. The UK remains a strong and leading actor on the world stage in its own right. We are a nuclear power, a member of NATO, and you'll see us playing a leading role in Warsaw next week, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, members of the Commonwealth, members of the G20 and the G7. Whatever the outcome of the consultations that will be taken forward with the EU in the years to come, you won't see the US withdrawing, the UK, withdrawing from the world stage. We will remain, as I said, a leading global actor. Thank you.
Thanks, David.